The 2024 Acura TLX Type S. This and the regular TLX have just received their mid-cycle refresh. So what does that mean? Well, there are some pricing changes, a minor list of mechanical changes, and of course, some aesthetic differences. Now let's talk about the interior and exterior first. The exterior treatment, you get a slightly different front fascia. Honestly, styling has changed a little bit, but it's gonna be pretty hard to tell them apart unless you're an Acura diehard. This is still a very good looking car. However, pricing, they've now simplified the trim levels. There's one way to get this, and it's $57,000 before tax, title, and destination. And there are a couple accessories like summer tires and 20-inch rims or wheels, carbon fiber trim, and a heated steering wheel. Honestly, the only one I would do is the heated wheel. The interior space has changed a little bit. You get some more sound deadening. We'll talk about how in the shop. And of course, you have bigger and better screens. Gone is the analog gauge cluster with their white back face, which was a Type S, Type R moniker. Now it's just a digital display, either a Pro or a Con, depending on who you are. It's easy to navigate, however. The non-touch capable giant infotainment screen is still giant. It's bigger than it used to be, apparently. You still have the touchpad to navigate it. It's terrible to use. But if you get into your wireless Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, you don't notice it that much. All of your HVAC controls and drive mode controls are physical and traditional, which is exactly what you want in a car like this. Everything else when it comes to the cabin is a carryover. So you still have great seats. They're very comfortable. They're heated and cooled. You have a very good seating position, great visibility, giant door pockets. This is now a quieter cabin than it used to be. So it's a pleasant place to be, and all the touch points and everything feels price appropriate. Back seats, while they're not the biggest by any means, if you are a reasonable sized human being, a smaller adult will fit back there, no issues. The trunk is very big and it is surprisingly usable. 2 international luggages will fit back there with some Jenga-ing. However, when you fold down the back seats, which do fold, you cannot pass anything through the rear due to the fact that there's a brace back there. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the ELS audio system. It is not audiophile grade, but it is quite good. The main issue with it is very bass heavy. It's sort of a V curve when it comes to the sound signature. Not the end of the world, most of its competitors are that way, but it is not the same ELS sound system that you find in the MDX Type S, which is substantially better. The best thing about this car, honestly, is pricing. It is substantially cheaper than its German competitors when equivalently equipped, anywhere between $5,000 to $7,000. Now with that, let's head in the shop and put this thing up on the lift. In the shop with the Acura TLX Type S. This is a 2024, which means this car just received a mid-cycle refresh. Something to know about the TLX lineup. Obviously, this comes with a regular car and of course the Type S. The Type S makes up about 25% of the sales, which is pretty substantial. For 24, being a mid-cycle refresh, most of this car is a carryover from a mechanical perspective. However, they did try to address 2 key problem areas, that is NVH and transmission tuning. So for NVH, they've added thicker carpeting to the floors. They've changed out the fender liners to help reduce some of that road and tire noise that Acuras typically struggle with. And there's more sound deadening in the B-pillar and door cards, which is very, very helpful. This car does feel more refined than the outgoing 2023 TLX. From a transmission perspective, because there are no mechanical changes to the drivetrain, just a software retune. It's supposed to be more responsive, which means they're trying to make sure the driver is in the right gear more of the time. The 10-speed automatic in the Acura Honda products is a mixed bag. Compared to its German rivals, to be honest, it's not as good. The reason Acura went with their own gearbox, which they will somewhat admit to, is they wanted to make sure that their supply chain was largely controlled internally, and they had some struggles with the ZF 9-speed in the past from a reliability perspective that they didn't want to have to deal with moving forward. So that's why they developed their own gearbox to use in all their cars. Now, from a technical perspective, what is the TLX Type S? Well, we've done a fairly comprehensive video on this already, so this will be my cliff notes. They take a regular TLX, they throw in a new front subframe, a 3-liter single-turbo V6. They made it to their 10-speed automatic. Makes about 355 horsepower and about 354 foot-pounds of torque. It is a quick car. The V6 in the aftermarket has made some spectacular power numbers. Stock, it's very reliable. Its one con is fuel economy. The fact that this is really, really heavy for its class, it's over 4,100 pounds, does not help this car. The static weight balance is 60% front, 40% rear. From a suspension perspective, the one great thing about the TLX, despite being a front-wheel drive architecture, is its double wishbone. One of the few cars in this class that gets dynamic camber gain in the front. And most of the suspension links are aluminum, and the car actually looks fairly expensive for the price point it is underneath. The vehicle still retains the legendary SH all-wheel drive or the torque factory rear diff, which takes up to 70% of the available torque, shoves it to the rear, and of that 70%, 100% of it can either go to the left or right of the rear wheels. That helps overdrive the rear of this car to get this thing to yaw out or rotate better. Type S does not mean Type R, which means this car is meant to be driven from like 5 to 8 tenths of total ability. And in that range, just like the MDX Type S, the car feels very nimble. In fact, more nimble than many of its competitors. It's the torque vectoring rear diff, the double wishbone suspension, and the recalibrated belt-driven EPS rack, which has a higher yaw gain ratio. So it means this car can get in and out of corners, at least initially, really, really well. If you can accept the compromises of what it's trying to be, it does drive quite well. So let's go take this for a quick drive with Mark.
We're back. Locked and loaded.
Type S, Mark. Show me what that means. As we understeer off the road. So, it's been a couple years since we've driven this car, and you had an MDX Type S with the same drivetrain as a long-termer for like 6 months. How does this car feel to you? Because I've spent a lot more time in this thing than you have.
Immediate impressions, and after not being in it for a while, clearly having not a big boat to drive around in and having this drivetrain in a sedan.
Versus the MDX.
Yeah, it's far more potent. If you're looking at this in isolation, it is way quicker. It's far more responsive. What I love about it is, this, regardless of the drive mode, is the immediacy in the steering. How quickly it turns in, how responsive it is, and how the rear differential is programmed to make this car feel smaller and lighter than it is. You can get around a normal commute like lightning. It makes the car feel at least 1,000 pounds less than what it really is, and it makes your normal commute and normal driving a lot more engaging. I will say, you know, as you go up to drive modes and you go up to like Sport Plus, the steering gets unnecessarily heavy. It feels almost synthetic compared to like comfort all the way up, but that directness is still there with the variable rack. You know, it always feels really, really eager to turn in and rotate through without completely plowing. And I know you said, oh, you know, as we understeer off the road, this car really doesn't have that problem if you stay below like 8 tenths and you leave it in automatic mode, because the transmission is, it's really good, man. Like, as soon as you start to understeer through a corner, the diff sends the power to the back, and clearly we're in cooler temperatures too, so it helps with the engine.
On all seasons.
Yeah.
To me, Mark, you know, this car, I'm going to talk about it more in the final thoughts, and I did talk about it in the shop. The advantage that this car has versus its competition is that it's inexpensive and it's double wishbone. Inexpensive is a relative term, but, and I think acknowledging what Type S means for Acura in their bigger cars, under 7 or let's call it 8 tenths, just like the MDX Type S, this thing feels very nimble. The immediacy is there, and you don't notice the inherent deficiencies of the car, right? Like, very few people really drive this vehicle as hard as you're doing right now. And even then, I mean, this is still not flat out track conditions.
Right.
And in that realm of like 7 to 8 tenths, you don't notice the fact that the gearbox is not as good as the ZF competition. You don't really pay attention to the fact that the drivetrain is not as powerful or as special feeling as what you get in the BMW or the Audi or even the Cadillac. This is basically almost the same price as the CT4V Blackwing, which makes 500 horsepower. Right. You're just left with the fact that a lot of the inputs are really, really good. And they are. Like, the steering's fast, the front end loads up. You don't notice crazy understeer, but when you start to drive this car hard, like really hard, like you're in a canyon road that isn't this flat farm road with 3 turns, the deficiencies of the weight, the fact that, you know, unlike all the marketing, this car cannot be tracked. It'll either overheat or cook the brakes. It doesn't want to really oversteer and rotate around. It's not a loose feeling car. that's the deficiency of this. That's what your $5,000 to $7,000 extra that you're paying for in the Blackwing and the M340i and a lot of those cars. That's what you're not getting in this vehicle.
Yeah.
But as a daily, it's amazing. It rides well. I think this thing looks great, which is one of the unique things about this class. And it's a good value. And the used proposition, which I know we haven't really talked about, I mean, you can get these things. I mean, I feel bad for the original owners, but the pre-refresh cars, like I sent you a couple, clean title, like 12,000 miles for $44,000 or $42,000. If you look around, that is an amazing deal.
Yeah, no, it is. It is a really good deal. And I know I had the same argument with you before, and I know you're always going to push for the rear-wheel drive competition.
Oh, even the Audi's all-wheel drive.
I know, but in the real world, this car has a great chassis. It feels tremendously direct and responsive. I mean, there's not a turn, and granted, not everybody lives in a canyon road. Not everybody lives where there's a bunch of corners. For your regular commute, what this thing is capable of with its all-wheel drive system defies logic. It defies its weight. It really is great to drive quickly. Now, you could make a bunch of arguments for different conditions. On super dry pavement on a hot day, the tires will give up, the brakes will give up. It's not going to be as nimble, but we're on semi-wet pavement on a gravel, and this thing just chews up the roads. Mm-hmm. Like, it's so confidence-inspiring. That the body, the way that the car moves around, the way that it feels, and the connectedness and the quickness and sharpness, it is really quick, but not in a negative way, because it turns as quickly as the steering reacts. The chassis setup is great. I will agree with you that the engine is in the cooler weather feels way better than it did when we first tested it. But it doesn't compete, of course, with your beloved B58, and the gearbox tuning is its weakest point. You have to keep this in automatic. We said that in the original video. You try to take manual control, it's horrible. It's not where it needs to be. And you could also argue that the engine should have far more output for what it is. But for real world driving, I mean, I love driving this thing. I mean, just in the short amount of time that we've done this, there's nothing that you can't do with it in a regular commute, and you're gonna have the all season capability. I think you could have a lot of fun with it. And, with the adaptive damper stuff, in comfort mode, it's still really good.
Compliant, and it's much quieter than it used to be.
It's much more quiet. In Sport Plus, it firms up just enough where you could drive it around in Sport Plus all the time. It has a lot of the things that the Acura Type S is good at. It's just, sadly, for an enthusiast product, I guess, and I know that's kind of what this is.
Yeah, it is an enthusiast product.
It is. It's lacking the transmission performance. I think having a good automatic tuning in here, having a really good automatic would
like the
help
dual clutch
Yes.
out of an Audi or the BMW 8-speed.
Yeah.
Personally, you're buying this car because you love Japanese cars, right? Like if it were me, I'd be in the Cadillac or the BMW. And people watching this channel know that about me.
Yeah.
If you love Japanese cars, you're going to look at this or like the Acura Type S. And then that becomes the next question. The Acura Type S, assuming you could get one for sticker, is like low 50s, if I remember.
Yeah.
I think that car, despite it being front-wheel drive and a four-popper, is very special to drive because all of the inputs are so good. And you can drive that thing flat out or at 8/10 and you have a good time. To me, I prefer that product because I feel like you are dynamically getting more car for your money than this thing.
I would totally disagree with you, and here's why.
All right.
If you took the Acura Type S and you threw this automatic in there,
it'd be horrible.
It would be, nobody would consider that car the car of the year, one of the best driving cars, and that just goes to show you how much a difference the transmission experience can be, namely in a manual transmission.
But in this world, you only get the Acura Type S as a manual.
I understand. So this is the same argument we had in the first video. If you took the center stack, if you're going to do another generation, how you get the Type S version to be great, you clean this up, you finally commit to having a manual transmission option. They wouldn't be able to keep these things. You could sell them all day long for years.
Yeah.
Now that's not going to happen. We know that Honda's not going to invest the money in that. But just knowing that they didn't do that, fixing the automatic transmission in here might make this more compelling, but I don't think it would be enough. I really don't think it would be enough. It needs to be far more, to your point, special as an enthusiast product than where it currently sits. And it's a byproduct of the era that it was engineered and designed in. I think they were trying to figure out what they wanted it to be and what they wanted it to do. And it's like 70% there, but it's not enough to hey, are you going to buy a manual BMW? You're going to buy a manual BMW over this if you can find one. You know, like, to your point, as a luxury product, most people, if you want all-wheel drive, probably a lot of people are going to go to Audi. So it's hard. It needs to do a little bit more to get to that. To get where the Integra Type S is, it needs to follow some of those same formulas.
This is a hard class. Like, unlike the SUV, the MDX Type S, we had the thing for so long. It's a great car because it is so much cheaper than the other three-row luxury SUVs. I mean, it is substantially cheaper, like tens of thousands of dollars less than an X7 fully loaded.
Yeah.
And in an SUV, your expectations, you're never going to drive it past 8 or 7/10.
Right.
The problem this has is the sports sedan market. People are more cognizant whether or not they're ever going to track or not. Is it a track-capable car? And it's in that class of car where to get people out of those like prestige brands like Audi, like BMW, like Mercedes, it needs to offer some X factor to get people into it, other than the fact that it's cheaper. And that's the one thing that I think hurts this car for a lot of people. But if you can look past all that, and you are that person who's value conscious, or you love Acura, or you just like the fact that you are getting a lot of car for your money, I do really like this thing.
I think the other thing you have to really think about is, we're talking about Type S.
Yeah.
If the regular TLX, it, unfortunately, because there's not a lot of sedans, it either needs to find the balance of being like a really good luxury sedan, a luxury sports sedan, where the Type S needs to go to that next level. And that's what this hasn't done enough of. The regular TLX, you could argue, is a value, like entry level. It's actually pretty good for what it is. It sits in a good place.
In the 40s.
In the 40s with all-wheel drive, So I don't know. Again, we're talking about a very difficult place for this brand to be. We know how this brand operates in terms of engineering budget, and it's hard to, in a world where this is not going to sell a lot, how much more do you put into it? How much more do you put into changing it and fixing some of these things? How much are you going to net in terms of a return? And I say this about a lot of brands. You have to go all in. If you're going to do this, you got to spend extra money to do it. And I think that's a really hard sell
for Acura, because they're a small brand.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of luxury cars, they're not a Lexus or a BMW.
Yeah, they don't have the development money to be pissing away on something that's kind of like, and namely, this is really a North American product.
Yeah,
right?
it's a niche car. Well, to be fair, Acura is a North American brand. But yeah, the thing that impresses me, and I mentioned this in the shop, is the fact that a quarter of all TLX sales are Type S's. Yeah. So there clearly is a demand for this car.
No, I'm not. And again, I think it's a tricky one, because we have high expectations of this brand and like this moniker.
Yeah, you and I are both Acura people.
Yeah,
Honda people.
And they did it with the Integra. So I would love to see them kind of like take this somewhere else. But as it stands, honestly, if you don't care about that last, like you always say, last 20% of performance, this thing does everything you want a fun sedan to do, and you can make a lot of excuses for, like I do, for the fact that it is really still a great car to drive on the street.
I think you love this thing if you bought it.
Yeah,
you really would. It's not a car that, again, while I do think there are better options, I don't fault anyone for buying this car, if that makes sense.
The last thing I'm going to say before you get into the final thoughts is, it has character. I know we say this like a broken record. Like, this doesn't feel like a cookie cutter Audi. Like, we got an RS3 or whatever it was, and it looks so generic inside. Yeah. Like, at least this has some type of style to it, some presence, and on the outside you can pick it apart from any one of its sedan counterparts.
Like every other 3 Series or every other Audi A4 or A5.
Yeah. And it's an X factor of this. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say, Jack.
All right, Mark, with that, let's head into my final thoughts. Final thoughts on the Acura TLX Type S. So why do you buy this car? Well, 2 reasons. First off, you're a die-hard Acura person or Honda person. You don't want to buy a BMW or a CT4V Blackwing. You want to buy an Acura. And if you're looking at it in a vacuum, this is a great car. Good engine, nice interior space, pretty good audio system, and it looks great. I will say the styling of the TLX Type S is tremendous for a sub $70,000 sports sedan. The other reason you're going to buy this is the value proposition. This thing's in the high 50s, $57,000, $58,000 before destination and tax. And it is between $5,000 and $10,000 less than its German rivals. An M340i with the same options is pushing $65,000 all day long. The The Audi S5 and S4 is more expensive with the same options, and those cars have higher running costs. Typically, the service of a BMW is more, maybe long-term reliability won't be as good as the Acura as well. However, objectively, once you put those cars back in the running, they all drive better than this thing. And that's the honest truth. The 340i is a more competent car from a technical perspective than the Acura TLX Type S. There's no ifs or buts about it. The G70 from Genesis, despite some of the issues of that brand, if you want to drive past 8/10, probably will handle better than this thing as well. So that's something to note. And if it were my money, I would just go get a CT4V Blackwing if I wanted a sports sedan. The car comes with a manual, 500 horsepower, it's well equipped at 65 grand, and it is arguably my favorite driving sports sedan, and it's within a stone's throw price-wise of this car. The compelling thing the TLX does, though, is the used offerings. If you're willing to buy a pre-refreshed car, you're looking at mid to low 40s for one of these things with like 12,000 miles. And that's a tremendous value for this car, because at that point, with or without a warranty, low running costs, and you're cross-shopping things like Golf Rs and GR Corollas for that price. And this car, from a overall livability and usability perspective, blow those cars out of the water. So with that, thanks for watching. Hope to see you soon.